Hi there. This is a quick review of Netflix's Sandman adaptation. It's a live-action adaptation of Neil Gaiman's seminal, critically praised graphic novel series, The Sandman. And originally I wasn't going to do this as a review, but I watched it anyway just for myself, and I figured I might as well just dash off a quick review for my subscribers in case any of you haven't checked it out yet, either because you haven't heard of the famous graphic novel series, or if you were worried that they could get it right. It's great. It is worth watching. I'm just giving some quick thoughts on it audio only. Because this is a Game of Thrones franchise YouTube channel I have here. But when I can, I like to cover other things like Lord of the Rings. I wasn't a giant Sandman expert, but I knew of it, I read it, and I was watching it for myself. The big reason I'm talking about this is Sandman, the House of the Dragon, Game of Thrones prequel, and the Lord of the Rings prequel were all in IMDb's big list of the top 10 most anticipated shows of 2022. They were the only ones that weren't like Marvel or Star Wars projects. And it was, exciting that these big fantasy franchises were all there, and that House of the Dragon was number one ahead of the other ones, but I don't see it as a competition because they're very different. And, George R. R. Martin himself, when this poll came out back in January, he said, I'm so impressed that, against these other titans of fantasy literature like Neil Gaiman, like Tolkien, people are still excited about our show. And then when Martin briefly got a light case of COVID right after San Diego Comic-Con, they gave him advanced copies of, because he knows Neil Gaiman, he gave him advanced copies of the Sandman DVD, and he marathoned it while he was quarantined in a hotel and thought it was really good too. So it has his vote of approval. You should really check it out. If you've never heard of Sandman, the short version is just as there's, like the Grim Reaper personification of death. Well, in their world, our world, it's originally started out as a Vertigo, which is a branch of DC Comics. I'll get back to that. That they're actually a family of 7 beings called the Endless, who are godlike beings that are the personifications of different aspects of humanity. So Death is one of them, who's like the Grim Reaper, but she's actually this cheerful goth girl. And then you have Dream, the Lord of Dreams. He's the personification of dream, just as she's the personification of death. His actual name is, he has a lot of names. They call him Morpheus, which is also the Lord of Dreams. And each of them rules over their own pocket dimension, plane of existence. His world is the dreaming. And there's other members of the family. In season 1, you see Desire, who is, the personification of desire or despair. Ones we didn't meet this season are like Destiny or Delirium. That the Endless are an interesting concept, and they play around with it. So it's not a superhero thing, it's a fantasy thing. He's the Lord of the Dreaming. And in the first issue, he gets captured by an Aleister Crowley-like occultist who's trying to capture Death. They capture him by accident, and he gets stuck in containment by their binding spell for decades. Now, the comic came out in the 80s, so in that he was freed after like 75 years. Here he was freed after 100 years. And the occultist who captures him is played by Game of Thrones alum Charles Dance, Tywin Lannister, but he's only in the first 2 episodes. And there are story arcs, but for the beginning, it's a mix of story arc and anthology episodes, which is good. That's what the comics did. And after he manages to escape, the first arc, at least, is he has to get all of his totems and tools back, like his helm, which is like his crown. So he goes to hell in the 4th episode because a demon stole it. And he has to confront Lucifer, played by Game of Thrones alum Gwendolyn Christie, who is a great choice. In the comic, Lucifer's kind of androgynous. So they have Gwen Christie play Lucifer, and it's very menacing, because it's sort of not just, hey, I'm snarking, I'm evil, but like passive-aggressive. Why, of course we're delighted to have you here, Lord Morpheus, but in a screw-you kind of way. That was a nice take on that, but just dashing off, I really liked it. I got together with college friends to marathon the first half one weekend, then the second half another weekend. You should try to marathon the whole thing, too, if you have time between House of the Dragon and Lord of the Rings. that when we're talking about like Hugo Awards later, or the Emmys, but the Hugo Awards and stuff, that these are things that should be major contenders, and it's, look at all these things that we have in the fantasy franchise coming out that aren't just another Marvel project or another Disney copy-paste Star Wars thing. Not that those are all bad, but it's really inventive. It's an analysis of it's very philosophical. It's about the nature of humanity, about people. It's not crime fighting. It's all sorts of stuff, and you can do literally anything with the Lord of Dreams. And when they get into other story arcs, and the thing with He Got Trapped, that wraps up by mid-season. That it was a 75-issue series, and there's 10 story arcs. They cover the first 2 story arcs in the first season, so first 5, then the next ones, and they just put out a bonus episode. Episode 11 was just some bonus issues they adapted, and there might be a 12th coming on the way. Big thing is that Neil Gaiman officially told the showrunner and directors, don't even try to do a frame-by-frame copy of the Sandman comics. It's work I did 30 years ago. I'm not Alan Moore telling you it has to be a comic book and exactly framed like this. It's a different medium. Things I did in the frames in the comic just wouldn't work in television. Try to make it a good TV show. So I went back and reread some key issues recently, like the 24 Hours one, which is episode 5, where they're trapped in a diner and he's using his powers on them, that it is almost line by line the same dialogue. Sometimes they mix the dialogue around a little, but the dialogue and story is utterly faithful to the comic. Visually, they weren't trying to do it as, oh look, it's comic book angles. They were trying to make it as a TV show. So that works out, that Gaiman was fully on board with that visually it doesn't need to be the comic. It's the story I was telling in a different form. Though from time to time they copy some of the key imagery, and once or twice they give an homage to a shot here or there. But it's very faithful to the spirit of it, but updated into visual. Like, another thing is they have the talking raven Matthew, voiced by Patton Oswalt. They put him in scenes with Morpheus to have someone to talk to give exposition. Because in a comic book, you can have internal monologues by the main character that, like in the Hell issue I just reread, it's just him alone. They send the Raven with him there so he can explain things to him. That's also fine. That's not like a giant change. That's pretty much any time you adapt a comic into live action, you need to deal with the exposition issues. So they played around with a little of that. A few characters were gender swapped, like Constantine is now Joan Constantine, but that worked out really good because she's a good actress, and I hope she gets a spin-off. So that didn't really affect anything here or there. Very faithful. A few people were annoyed that Death is played by a black woman when it's like, they can look like anything. They have a default who's the main person they play it. There's points where Morpheus looks like a black man or a cat or a woman, depending on who he's appearing to, because he's the Lord of Dreams. Like the Grim Reaper can look like anything. And my thing is just, well, in the comics, the Endless have like bone white skin, and they were never going to look like that in a TV show, so a TV show would never 100% replicate their appearance from the comics anyway. That the personification of Death character isn't going to look exactly like this bone white skinned person, so the actress they got was great. I didn't really have a problem with that. It was weird, this is the whole thing when the show came out, that bigots online were yelling at Gaiman, oh, you're so woke, when this was a really progressive for its time comic book with a lot of genderqueer characters in it and a lot of female roles. They were calling him woke because desire, is a concept, so desire is kind of like a hermaphrodite. Desire is both male and female and referred to as they. In the comic, written in the early 90s, come on. So they cast Mason, this famous trans actor who's in the Netflix Cowboy Bebop thing, to play Desire, and I thought, oh, that was a cool idea, because in the comics that's what Desire is like. And Gaiman himself was like, why are people complaining? That isn't a change. That's what Desire is like in the comic written 30 years ago. So that was weird that people just aren't paying attention. But they really, that's what the comic was like. And story-wise, line for line, it's almost exactly like it dialogue-wise. The camera work is better, frankly, because for a TV format. Other things in terms of acts, I really liked that they played, that the actor who plays Morpheus really got that he's distant, but there's a tinge of sadness to him. He's distant, ethereal, but it's subtle. There's this tinge of sadness there. And I really liked that secondary character is played by Stephen Fry, who I'm really, because he had prostate cancer a few years ago. I was worried if his health was in decline. He seems doing okay now. I'm happy he just had, it was a bit part as one of the other Dream characters, but it was nice to see him. Another thing which I didn't have a problem with is, again, Vertigo unfortunately they got rid of Vertigo, was loosely aligned with DC Comics. Keep in mind that DC Comics includes, like, the pantheon of Greek gods and spiritual concepts when you get to, like, things like the wider issues and Dr. Fate and stuff, so every now and again, DC Comics characters would appear in the background of this, like Arkham Asylum is in the background of the story, or Etrigan the Demon and the King Arthur mythos from all of that was in the background. But, like, Etrigan isn't in the Hell episode, nor should he be. That's a very specific DC Comics character. So, yeah, and the thing is, Constantine is in it. Constantine is also a DC Comics character. That was in there. But they removed the overt connections to other DC things, which was a good idea. They should have. It should stand on its own. Similarly, in the Hell arc, in the comic, Lucifer, because of some story point with Constantine, was in a triumvirate with Beelzebub and Azazel. They cut that out, so Lucifer's just the sole ruler of Hell. Again, because it's separated from ongoing comic storylines. I'm talking about the Hell episode a lot, but yeah, that's another thing. People thought it was funny that at one point, Brienne, Gwendolyn Christie, mentions, a dire wolf. In the original comic, it mentions dire wolf. That's just a happy coincidence that she's from a show that has dire wolves in it. So I was also really impressed by the arc in the second half of the season by the guy that plays the Corinthian, who's this serial killer demon. And he's sort of the big bad of season 1. Now, there's 2 cons I do want to mention before I leave, though. Everything was great except for 2 things which I feel were unavoidable. The first is, the first 2 episodes are really exposition-heavy and kinda clunky, and the series only hits its stride starting in episode 3 when Constantine shows up, and if not that, episode 4 when he goes to Hell. That the first 2 episodes, I've heard other people saying I didn't really like the first 2 episodes. If you haven't touched this before, power through the first 2 episodes. They needed to get the exposition through. And, like, they added the Corinthian earlier, and he doesn't show up in the time frame of the first 2 issues. He'd be giving info dumps about this is what Morpheus is, this is what the Endless are, and he's Lord of the Dreaming. Because there's info dumps you can do in the comic format that you can't easily do in a TV show, where someone can slow down and read something. So they needed to do that, and I wouldn't take it out given the choice. It's just the first 2 episodes are a little slow, and they're a little limited, because he's trapped for most of the first episode. And you think, this is a relatively limited camera work. The camera work reminds me of Good Omens, which is Gaiman's other thing. Then they shift to, and here we are in this sprawling hellscape. Here we are in London. Here we are in the dream world, and it's entirely different. That was one of the aspects of the comic series that was it could be anything. So don't judge it by the first 2 episodes. Power through is my first big piece of advice. Second thing, which is kind of just a criticism, is, it's not really criticism, the CGI is functional at best. And it starts, like, the first episode has a lot of not great CGI when they show this is what the dreamscape is like. The best parts of the show are just when he's walking on the street with his sister Death, and they're talking about the nature of humanity, and that she's the angel of death, basically, and he's the personification of dreams. That The best parts are when this person in costume is talking about I is the personification of death or dreaming. I think the nature of humanity is like this. Um, or his confrontation with the Corinthian, it doesn't really need to be CGI. So if you're looking for a lot of eye candy in the style of the Lord of the Rings prequel, or even House of the Dragon had some pretty good, like there's dragons in it. It's not that kind of show, so it doesn't really matter, is my point. That some people are really turned off. They saw the first two and went, oh, the CGI gargoyle in it doesn't look too great. Well, it's functional and it's not really the focus of the story, so whatever. The best parts are when it's just people talking, or he has a man from the 1500s who that he made a bet with death that if he lived forever he'd want to die eventually. So also in episode 6, best of the season, it's this montage of him meeting this man every 100 years in a tavern in London, and the costumes update with every century. So it goes to Shakespeare times, the 1700s, to the 1800s. It doesn't need CGI in that scene. It's just costuming and period setting. So that was a really effective, fantasy sci-fi concept that didn't need a wisp of CGI at all. That was amazing. Like episode 6, I don't think even had any CGI in it at all, through that or talking about death or anything. And it was the strongest episode of the season, so don't judge it for the CGI stuff. It's meant to be there just to do things that would be physically impossible to do physically. But they know it's not great, so they don't lean onto it. Like Merv, the gardener in the Dreamscape, who's got a pumpkin for a head. He's a scarecrow, voiced by Mark Hamill. They know don't overuse him, but he's such a fan favorite character they had to try. So I don't know what's going on with this show in terms of budget and renewal. That will always be something scary, particularly because of the state that Netflix is in these days. But if you haven't read the comics, it is entirely accessible. You don't need to read the comics to see it. Yes, dive into Sandman. And if you are a fan of the comics who is hesitant that they could do it well, it is very faithful to the comics, but not in a slavish way, as the seal of approval of Gaiman himself. George R. R. Martin also said it was really good. You should be watching Sandman. But my advice is watch the first 5 episodes or so, or at least the first 3 or 4, in a binge watch, because the first 2 are just set up, and the best ones were when it's just people talking in rooms about, I am a dream, these are my hopes and fears, and all of that. That works out pretty well. So I'm really looking for. I did not think it would be this good. There was a long road to getting Sandman adapted. And I got really excited last week when they put out a bonus episode. So this is another. Are we seeing a fantasy renaissance now after the Game of Thrones ending was so bad and traumatizing in late 2019? I heard people saying that this will end the fantasy TV wave, that as the show was ending, people were going, what will be the next Game of Thrones? And I remember seeing news articles that came out just in the summer saying, as we're looking ahead to House of the Dragon, to Lord of the Rings, to Sandman, nothing that tried to be the next Game of Thrones really did. All these shows that launched from 2017 to 2018 as Game of Thrones was winding down, such as The Witcher is decent. People like The Witcher. I heard season 2 was a little wonky in places. I've heard criticism of the Wheel of Time the Wheel of Time adaptation. I hope they smooth that out by the second season. But big budget attempts to be the next Game of Thrones that were launched at the time. Witcher was leader of the pack, but even that didn't quite succeed. That by last year I was hearing people say, wow, season 8 of Game of Thrones really destroyed the buzz about epic fantasy series on TV, and now within the space of a month, because Sandman came out August 5th, House of the Dragon August 21st, and then, September, but September 2nd, Lord of the Rings. Within the space of 4 weeks, we're getting premiere adaptations for Sandman, a Game of Thrones prequel, and a Lord of the Rings prequel. So is this a renaissance of the fantasy genre? It doesn't even need to be epic fantasy, because they are different. Westeros is low fantasy, and Lord of the Rings is high fantasy, and they're different to begin with. They're different subgenres. So they're not really directly competing. They're like Lord of the Rings is PG-13, whereas House of the Dragon is R-rated, and it's supposed to be that way for both of them. The apples and oranges are not comparable. Sandman, I mean, it defies genre classification. It isn't armies and stuff. It's not a superhero thing. It's a dark fantasy is the best way you can describe it. Very philosophical, and it's not an action show. It's not trying to be an action show. It's dark fantasy, elements of horror. I thought it was really good. There were standout performances in it. The first two episodes were a little exposition heavy and clunky. Just power through that. The CGI isn't great. It doesn't need to be because it doesn't really rely that much on CGI. In terms of the faithfulness to the original, all very good, and I'm really looking forward to season 2. Whenever or wherever that may be happening. So we'll see what happens. So tell me your thoughts in the comments. I had already seen Sandman. I wasn't intending to make a review. And I said, I might as well dash off an unscripted one to hear what you guys thought if you saw it. And if you haven't seen it, urge you to, this should be on your watch list of shows for 2022. Maybe you won't have time to catch up now with House of the Dragon and Lord of the Rings, but add it to your watch list on the Netflix app or something to catch up with this. This is one of the shows to watch. Particularly if you think like Witcher and Wheel of Time might be winding down. This is starting up. This will be one of the big things everyone talks about come award season.